The candle was almost gone. Norma Hayes Marsh stood inside the cave with her back to the entrance, holding what was left of it, 2 inches of pale wax, the flame bending sideways in a breath of air that came from somewhere deeper in the rock. She had been standing still for a long time, long enough that the cold of the limestone had moved through the soles of her bare feet and settled somewhere in her shins. She didn't notice the cold. She was looking at the wall. The marks had been there when she first came in 2 days ago. She had seen them then scratched into the surface of the pale rock, dozens of them at different heights. The kind of thing you find in old caves all through the hills of Harlan County, Kentucky. People passing through. People waiting out weather. People who needed somewhere that wasn't anywhere, just for a little while. They left marks the way people always leave marks when they feel invisible, just to prove they were there. Tally lines, small drawings, a shape that might be a dog or might be a man running, a sun with uneven rays. The ordinary record of people trying to hold on to the fact of their own existence. She had seen all of it. She had not paid attention to it. She had been too tired. But now, on this second morning, with the light coming through the crack in the rock at a different angle, she was looking at something she had missed before. Not the old marks. Something newer. Lower on the wall at the height of a person crouching. The cuts in the stone were sharper, less worn by time. The color of fresh limestone where it's been worked against, not the gray-brown of decades of dust and moisture. Someone had been here. Not long ago. She moved closer. Held the candle near the wall. The handwriting was small and pressed tight together. The letters slightly uneven, slanting up and to the right. She read the first 3 words and then she stopped. She stood there, in that cave, with the candle burning down and those 3 words in front of her. And she did not move for a very long time. She knew that handwriting. She had known it for 12 years. She had seen it on the back of envelopes, on the notepad stuck to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a horseshoe, on the feed store receipts he kept in a rubber-banded stack in the kitchen drawer, on tax documents and supply lists and the small slips of paper he left on the kitchen table when he had gone somewhere early and didn't want to wake her. 3 words cut into the rock with something sharp. "I need to finish." She said nothing. She did not say his name. But she pressed her fingers against the letters very carefully. The way you touch something you are afraid of breaking, though. There was nothing left to break. And she felt for the first time since the morning she stood at the sink, watching the county road from the kitchen window, while someone called to tell her what had happened. She felt something shift inside her chest. Not grief. Not quite. Something older than grief and harder to name. The recognition of a man she thought she had already lost before she lost him. His name was Calhoun Marsh. Everyone called him Cal. He had died 11 days ago of what the county coroner called a massive cardiac event. He was 52 years old. People at the funeral had said quietly the way people say things at funerals that don't require them to look at each other. Happens at that age. They said it like a door closing, like a thing that had already been filed and could not be reopened. Norma had let them say it. It was easier in those first days to let things be what they appeared to be. But standing in that cave, her fingers touching her dead husband's words cut into limestone, she understood for the first time that easier had always been the wrong direction. The voice that came out of her mouth was low and steady, not the voice of someone in crisis, the voice of someone on the far side of it. I didn't know what Cal had left in there, she said. To no one, to everyone, to the dark that pressed in from the back of the cave. But the moment I recognized his handwriting on that rock, I understood why they needed him gone. She stood there in the silence after her own words, outside the cave through the narrow passage and the main chamber, and the thin slot of light that cut through the rock. Kentucky was going about its business, wind in the trees, a bird calling somewhere down the ridge. The ordinary sounds of a world that did not stop for any particular person's reckoning. Inside the cave, a woman stood holding a candle and deciding what she was gonna do next. That was 3 days ago. This is what happened before it. Harlan County, Kentucky is not the kind of place people choose. It is the kind of place people are born into and stay in because the roots go down deeper than any reason to leave. The hills fold in on themselves here, green and steep, and the valleys between them hold small towns that have been there long enough to forget what they were built for. The coal is mostly gone. The mines that drove 3 generations of men underground have been sealed or flooded, or simply abandoned, their mouths standing open in the hillsides, like questions nobody is answering anymore. But the bones of what the coal built the land, ownership, the family hierarchies, the unspoken accounting of who owes what to whom, those things do not go away when the industry does. They calcify. They become part of the geography. The Marsh family had been in Harlan County since before the First War. The grandfather came in 1919 with nothing but a truck and a willingness to bet on land that other people couldn't see the value in. He was right, and for a while that made him lucky. His son Glendon was less lucky and less patient, which turned out to be more dangerous. Glendon Marsh did not wait for opportunity the way his father had. He created conditions. He understood with the quiet precision of a man raised among people who had things he wanted. Exactly how much pressure it takes to make a neighbor sell at the wrong price. He had done it enough times that it had stopped feeling like anything other than business. His brother Royce ran the paperwork. That was Royce's role in the family, the one who knew which desk to visit, which clerk to talk to, which form to file and in what order, and how long to wait before filing the next one. Royce was not a smart man in the way people mean when they call someone smart. He was a careful man, which in certain families is worth more. And then there was Cal. Calhoun Marsh was the wrong kind of son for the Marsh family to have produced. Not wrong in the sense that he was weak, he wasn't. He could run a farm in the hill country of eastern Kentucky from before dawn to after dark without complaint, and the work showed in his hands. But somewhere in him there was a different set of measurements than the ones his father used. He looked at people, at actual people, their faces, their circumstances, the weight they were carrying, and what he saw mattered to him. This was a liability in a family that had prospered by not looking too carefully. He named every cow on the farm, not as a joke. He just felt that things deserved to be distinguished from each other, to have some individual acknowledgement of the fact that they existed. Once, when a baby mockingbird fell out of a nest near the barn, he spent 3 hours trying to save it. He kept it warm. He tried to feed it with an eyedropper. When it died anyway, he buried it in a tin that had once held shortbread cookies, because he said a creature that tried that hard to live deserved something better than the grass. He said it without sentiment, the way he said most things, as a plain statement about what was owed to the world. He was 40 years old when he met Norma Hayes in a diner outside of town, sitting alone at a corner table reading the local paper from the first page to the last. Not skimming. Reading. Like a man who wanted to understand the world, not just confirm what he already thought about it. She noticed that. She noticed very little else about him that day, because she had learned to be careful about what she noticed in men. But that the slow, deliberate reading of a paper in a diner alone, as if it mattered, stayed with her longer than she expected. He asked her to dinner the following week. She said yes for reasons she still couldn't fully explain even 12 years later. Walking down a county road alone in the September heat, with a rolling suitcase that needed a new wheel. Yama. The funeral was on a Saturday. The county was dry hot the way it gets in September in the mountains. The moisture gone out of the air. The grass on the roadsides. The color of things that have given up. The church was small and full. Cal had been known in Harlan County for his whole life, which meant that half the people in the pews had their own private accounting with the Marsh family, and showing up was part of maintaining that accounting. The other half came because they had genuinely liked him, and they were quieter than the first group, and sat closer to the back. Norma wore the black dress she had bought for her mother's funeral 6 years before. It still fit, which felt like an indictment of something she couldn't name. She sat in the front pew with Winifred Marsh on one side and the empty air of what should have been a family on the other. She had lost 2 pregnancies in those 12 years. The first at 5 months. The second at 13 weeks. Cal had cried both times on his own shoulder, not hers. He said once quietly that he needed to hold himself together so she could fall apart. She had been angry at him for that. She understood it now. It was the language he had been given for love, and it was the wrong language, and he had used it anyway because it was all he had. She thought about that during the service. She thought about it while the minister spoke, and while the choir sang, and while the people around her did the careful social choreography of communal grief. She sat still, and she thought about the man she had married, and the man he had become in the last year, and whether those were 2 different men or the same man under different kinds of pressure. She did not cry during the service. The tears were there, but they were backed up behind something harder, something she didn't have a name for yet. Opal Winters came to find her during the reception. Opal was 72 years old and had lived 3 properties down from the Marsh place for as long as anyone could remember. She was a small, bent woman with thick-lensed glasses and a garden she talked to, the way most people talk to their families, with authority and affection, and the occasional expression of disappointment. Her husband, Harold, had died 4 years before, and since then she had become, if anything, more direct, as if his death had removed the last reason she had for softening what she said. She found Norma in the kitchen refilling the coffee urn. She touched Norma's elbow. "You're going to need somewhere to go," Opal said in a voice low enough not to carry. "When the Marsh family does what they're going to do." Norma looked at her. "Opal, there's a cave up past Miller's Creek," Opal said, "behind the old quarry ridge. You take the trail past the creek and you keep going up until the rock changes. You'll see it. It's between 2 limestone outcroppings set back behind some brush. You'd walk right past it if you didn't know." "Why are you telling me this now?" Opal looked at her over the top of her glasses. The look was not unkind. It was the look of someone who has been watching a situation develop for longer than the other person realizes and is now simply delivering the conclusion. "Because I've known Winifred Marsh for 40 years," she said, "and I know what she's about to do before she does it." She patted Norma's arm once firmly, and then she went back to the sitting room with her tea. Norma stood in the kitchen and looked at the coffee urn and thought 40 years. She wondered what 40 years of watching the Marsh family looked like from the outside. She wondered what it looked like from the inside. She had only 12 years, and she wasn't sure she had been paying the right kind of attention even then. The guests left in the late afternoon. The house settled into the particular quiet of a place that has just been full of people and is now empty. Norma was in the kitchen washing cups that didn't need washing when she heard Winifred's footsteps on the hardwood floor behind her. She didn't turn around. She heard the sound of the key ring being set on the kitchen table. A small, flat sound. A sound with the weight of finality in it. "This was never your home," Norma Winifred said. "It's time for you to go." Norma turned off the faucet. She set the cup she was holding into the rack. She dried her hands on the dish towel folded over the oven handle, and she turned around. Winifred Marsh was standing in the middle of the kitchen with her spine straight and her hands at her sides. 70 years old and still built like someone accustomed to not being questioned. She was looking at a point somewhere near Norma's left shoulder, not at her face. She had said what she came to say. There was nothing else. Norma looked at her for a moment, at this woman she had lived alongside for 12 years, whose house she had cleaned and whose meals she had cooked, and whose son she had buried today. And she did not feel the thing she expected to feel. She did not feel rage. She felt something quieter and more total than that. She felt the confirmation of something she had suspected for a long time, without letting herself know she suspected it. "All right," Norma said. That was all she said. She went upstairs and she packed. She didn't take much. She was not a person who had accumulated much that was truly hers. The wedding photograph from the dresser, her and Cal standing outside a courthouse, squinting into the afternoon sun. Both of them younger by 12 years and lighter in a way that had nothing to do with weight. The silver locket that had been her mother's. The one that held a photograph so small and worn by handling that you could barely make out the faces. But she knew whose they were. The composition notebook where she kept the old remedies her grandmother had taught her what to make for fever, for insomnia. What plants along a creek bank had uses that most people had forgotten. Clothes, shoes, and then she didn't know why. She did this. Not, then she opened the kitchen drawer, and she took a paring knife. Not the biggest knife in the drawer. Not a weapon in any dramatic sense. Just a knife. Her hand took it and put it in the side pocket of the suitcase before her mind had caught up with the decision. She zipped the pocket closed and she didn't think about it again. She rolled the suitcase out of the bedroom. She walked down the stairs. She went through the front hallway and out the door. She did not close the door behind her. Not out of carelessness. Out of something harder than politeness. The county road that runs from the Marsh property to the state highway is 7 miles of packed gravel and red clay wide enough for one truck in most places and 2 trucks, if both drivers know the road. Norma had driven it hundreds of times. She had ridden it on the back of Cal's truck with the window down in summer. She had walked one section of it years ago when the truck got a flat tire. and they came home at 11 o'clock at night, laughing about something she no longer remembered. The laughing part she remembered. The thing they were laughing about was gone. She walked it now with the suitcase. The wheel on the left side of the bag made a grinding rhythm against the gravel, a metronome for a song nobody wanted. The sun was already halfway up and cutting sideways, the kind of September light that gives you no mercy and no shade. The grass on both sides of the road was the tan gold color of something that had stopped trying. She had taken her shoes off. The black heels from the funeral were not made for gravel roads, and her feet hurt less on the warm, packed earth beside the shoulder. She thought about Cal, not the Cal of the last year. That man she had already mourned before she mourned the actual one. The man who slept facing the wall. The man who answered questions with fragments. The man who left the house without explanation and came home hours later with his face carrying something he wouldn't put down and wouldn't talk about. She had tried those last months to reach him through the wall he had built. She had stopped trying somewhere around April. Not because she gave up, but because she ran out of approaches. She thought about the other one, the man she had said yes to over dinner who ate slowly and asked questions that showed he had been listening to everything she said 5 minutes ago, not just the last sentence. The man who brought a coffee to the barn every morning because he said animals shouldn't have to start a cold morning looking at a person who was still half asleep. The man who drove 3 hours to bring her mother's furniture up from her mother's house after the funeral and didn't ask to be thanked and wouldn't have known what to do with the thanks if it had been offered. She had loved him for exactly the kind of person he was. And that person she had learned in the last year of his life had been carrying something that she hadn't known about and that had been eating the space between them from the inside. She didn't know yet what it was. She had a direction. She had Opal's voice saying Miller's Creek and Quarry Ridge, and you'd walk right past it if you didn't know. She had the sense not yet formed into anything she could call a thought that the last year of Cal's silence had not been what it looked like. At the state highway she stopped. Left was town. 6 hours by bus to a city where she had a cousin she hadn't seen in a decade. A life she had left and not missed. A set of rooms in other people's buildings and other people's structures. The kind of life that would take her in and ask nothing of her and mean nothing either. Right was the hills, the old Quarry Ridge, a cave that Opal Winters had described with the specificity of someone who was not guessing. She stood there for a minute. A pickup truck went past her without slowing, trailing a rooster tail of dust. She turned right. The trail past Miller's Creek had not been maintained in years. The undergrowth had come back across it in most places, which in eastern Kentucky meant a particular tangle of mountain laurel and blackberry cane, and the tough volunteer saplings that fill in any open space the moment nobody is watching. Norma pushed through it with one hand and dragged the suitcase with the other. And the suitcase caught on roots and on rocks and on the cane, and she stopped dragging it eventually and carried it instead. The land rose steeply past the creek. The rock changed character as she went up the old sandstone of the lower slopes, giving way to the pale gray limestone of the ridge, exposed in outcroppings along the trail, like the bones of the hill showing through. Limestone country in Kentucky means caves. The water that falls on these ridges spends years working its way down through the rock, finding cracks, widening them, carving rooms inside the hill that nobody knows about from the surface. Harlan County is full of them. Most people know this in the abstract and have never seen the inside of one. She almost missed it. The entrance was set back from the trail behind a stand of mountain laurel that had grown thick enough to make a kind of wall. You would have to know to look behind it. Between two limestone faces, each angled slightly toward the other, like shoulders hunching against the cold, there was a gap, vertical, about 5 feet high and wide enough for a person to enter sideways. Norma stood in front of it for a long time. The air coming from inside was cold, in a way that had nothing to do with wind or shade. Something older. The cold of rock that has not been touched by sunlight in geological time. It smelled of damp stone and deep earth, and something she did not have a word for. Not unpleasant, not pleasant, just present. The smell of a place that had been exactly itself for longer than anything around it had been anything at all. She thought, there is nothing waiting for me in the other direction. She bent her head and she walked in. The cave was larger inside than the entrance suggested. The main chamber was maybe 30 feet across at its widest point, the ceiling vaulting up unevenly to perhaps 10 feet at the highest. The floor was packed earth, cold and hard underfoot. To her right, a narrow crack in the rock admitted a blade of afternoon light that fell across an area of perhaps 3 square yards. Not enough to see by, but enough to know direction. To her left, at the back of the chamber, a passage bent away into complete darkness. She stood inside the entrance and let her eyes adjust. When they had, she found a hollow in the rock near the light crack where she could prop the candle. She gathered the dry sticks and leaves that had blown in through the crack over years of wind. She spread her coat on the floor and sat on it with her back against the limestone wall. And she looked at the flame for a long time. The flame did not move. Inside the cave there was no wind and it burned straight and still. In 3 days of the funeral, and its before, and its after, it was the first thing she had looked at that did not seem to be waiting for something from her. She let herself cry. It was not the kind of crying that is about grief exactly, though grief was in it. It was the other kind, the kind that accumulates over years of half-words and photographs, where your smiling and gratitude perform for things that were never yours. The kind that comes out ugly and total, when there is finally no one around to require you to hold it together. Her shoulders shook, and her arm came up to cover her face, and she let it go. All of it. The house that was never hers. The children she had not been able to keep. The man she had loved and then lost, before she lost him, and then lost again in the ordinary way. The woman she might have been if she had made different choices, and whether it was too late to find out what that woman looked like. When it was over, she felt empty in the way good, cleared earth feels empty, not depleted but clean. Prepared for something. She put out the candle to save it. She lay down on her coat. She slept. She slept through the rest of the afternoon and all of the night, and well into the following day. When she woke, the light through the crack in the rock was already shifting toward orange. Late afternoon. She had slept a full day. She lay still for a moment, looking up at the ceiling of the cave, listening to the sound of her own heartbeat and the slow drip of water somewhere deeper in the rock. Then she turned her head. She had not looked carefully at the right-hand wall, the one nearest the light crack. Not on the first day. She looked at it now. The marks covered almost 6 feet of wall space at varying heights. Old marks and newer marks layered over each other, across what might have been decades or longer. Tally lines in groups of 5. Small drawings, an animal that might be a deer or a dog. A sun with uneven rays radiating outward, a figure with arms raised that could be a tree or a person or both. The ordinary record of people passing through a hard time, leaving evidence of themselves. She moved closer. At the lower section of the wall near the floor, there was a different kind of mark. Not tallies or drawings, letters. Small and close together, written at the height of a person crouching down close to the ground, as if the writer had not wanted the words to be found easily, as if they were hiding something in plain sight. The color of these cuts in the stone was darker than the old marks, more recent. The limestone still pale and fresh where the tool had worked it. Norma lowered herself to her knees. She held the candle close to the wall. She read. The first 3 words were clear. I need to finish. She stopped. She had been breathing normally until that moment. Her breath stopped now, not dramatically but completely, as if her body had made a unilateral decision to pause all non-essential functions until the eyes confirmed what they were telling the brain. She knew that handwriting. She had known that handwriting for 12 years. The particular way the capital I stood up straight, with a slight lean to the left. The way the letters pressed into each other in a hurry when the thought was moving faster than the hand. The small gap between the last letter and the period, like a person taking a breath before they put the point down. That was Cal's handwriting, cut into the limestone of this cave by something sharp. A nail maybe, or a pocket knife, pressed and dragged letter by letter in the dim light of a lantern, or a phone screen, or something smaller and more careful. This wall was not an accident. These words were not random. He had come here. He had crouched at this height. And he had written these things, and he had done it in a cave that no one else used, in a location that no one would think to mention, except a 72-year-old woman who talked to her garden and had been watching the Marsh family for 4 decades. Norma reached out with her right hand and pressed her fingertips against the letters. She pressed very gently, the way you touch something broken, though there was nothing left to break, only things left to read. She moved the candle slowly along the wall. More text, some of it damaged by the moisture that seeped through the limestone in this part of the cave. Fragments. Enough to know there was more. Enough to know that he had been here more than once, that he had come back. That he had been building something here in the dark, word by word, stone by stone. And then at the end of the readable section, before the moisture had eaten the letters beyond recovery, she found one more line. The handwriting was smaller here, more compressed. The hand that wrote this had been pressing harder, like someone finishing a sentence they knew might be the last one. I buried everything at the bottom. She read it twice. She stayed on her knees with her hand flat against the wall for a long time after that. Behind her, the light through the crack in the rock was shifting, going orange. The cave's quiet way of saying that the day was ending, and a person needed to decide whether they were going or staying. Norma stayed. She looked at the passage that bent away into the back of the cave, the one she hadn't gone near yet. The one where the light didn't reach and the cold came from that deeper, stranger cold of places where the rock goes down further than you can see. She looked at it for a long time. Then she reached for the second candle. Ooh. The passage narrowed almost immediately. Norma had to turn sideways within the first few feet, holding the candle out ahead of her with one arm, while the limestone pressed against her back and her chest in the same moment. The ceiling dropped. She bent at the waist, then lower, moving through the dark, by feel as much as by the small orbit of light the candle threw. The cold deepened as she went, and the ceiling came lower and the walls pressed closer. And she moved through it all by paying attention to one thing at a time: where to put her foot, where to put her hand where the passage bent. The candle flame leaned back as she moved forward as if it were reluctant. She understood the feeling. The passage turned once sharply left and then opened. The inner chamber was smaller than the main room, maybe 15 feet across the ceiling lower, but still high enough to stand upright. The walls were close enough that she could feel the weight of them. The silence here was different too. In the main chamber there had been the ambient hiss of wind through the crack, and the occasional sound of something living, a bat maybe, or just the stone settling in its own geologic time. Back here there was nothing. Just the complete total quiet of a place that had been sealed against the world. She held the candle up and turned slowly. In the corner to her right there was a pile of rocks. Not a natural pile. She understood this immediately, the way you understand certain things without being able to say exactly how. The rocks were stacked with intention. They were roughly the same size, chosen for how they fit together, placed in an order that distributed weight evenly. Someone had thought about this. Someone had taken time with it. She crossed the chamber and crouched beside the pile. She moved the top stone, then the next, then 3 more. The stones were cold and fit together tightly enough that a couple of them required both hands. She set each one aside carefully, not making more noise than she had to, though there was no one to hear her. Some habits go deeper than their reasons. Beneath the stones was a tin. It was a cookie tin, the round kind with a lid, the sort that shows up in every rural household in America in the months around Christmas, full of shortbread or peanut brittle or whatever the family specialty was, and then kept for years afterward to hold everything from sewing supplies to loose change, to documents that needed to be kept somewhere safe. This one was the dark green of old paint, the lid design worn almost smooth with handling. The lid was sealed with black electrical tape wound 3 times around the circumference. Wound with care. Wound by someone who wanted to keep moisture out. She looked at the tin for a moment before she opened it. A tin for keeping things safe. Cal had used one before for smaller purposes, a mockingbird that tried hard to live. She had not thought about that in years. She thought about it now. Norma took the paring knife from the pocket of her coat. She had brought the coat back here with her, and she cut the tape. She opened the tin. She opened. Inside, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag knotted at the top, was a composition notebook with a black cardboard cover. The kind sold in drugstores for $1.50. The kind students use. Underneath the notebook, flat against the bottom of the tin, was a small digital voice recorder. The type made by Sony in the late 2000s and early 2010s, silver-cased about the size of a thumb drive with ambitions. It had been sealed inside a Ziploc bag. The bag itself pressed flat to remove the air. Before sealing the way someone careful about moisture would do it, and beneath that, folded into quarters, 3 sheets of paper. She took the notebook first. She undid the knot in the grocery bag, shook it loose, turned the notebook over in her hands once. The cover was unmarked. She opened it to the first page. Cal's handwriting looked up at her from the paper, the way a face does from a photograph with all the life that was in it when it was made preserved by the stillness of the medium, unable to account for what had happened since. She needed to sit down. Her knees made the decision for her. She was on the floor of that chamber coat spread under her candle, propped in a crack at the base of the wall before she had completed the thought. Her back found the limestone. The notebook was in her lap. She began to read. He had started writing here almost a year before he died. The first entry was dated the previous November. She had been in this same house in November, sleeping in the same bed, sitting across the same kitchen table. She tried to map what she remembered of that November onto what she was reading now, and the two things did not fit together in any way she could make sense of. I started writing here because I can't write at home. The walls of that house have ears that aren't mine. He wrote without drama. That was the first thing she understood about the notebook. It was not a confession, not a cry for help, not the kind of document people imagine when they imagine someone leaving a record of something dangerous. It read like a log, like the feed records he kept in the barn, exact and economical. What he knew, what he had found, what it meant, and what it didn't mean, and where the gaps were. The handwriting was the same handwriting as always, undecorated, the letters doing exactly what letters are for and no more. He had started with Virgil Ferris. Virgil Ferris had been a laborer in Harlan County. Not a farmer exactly, more of a man who worked whatever work was available, which, in eastern Kentucky, meant he had driven trucks and cleared brush and laid fence and done a dozen other things that fall under the general heading of making a living in a place where making a living requires improvisation. He had a wife named Mary and two sons. The older one was named Everett and would have been about 16 when his father disappeared. The younger one, Denny, was maybe 13. Virgil Ferris had been gone for 9 years. The official record said he had been involved in an accident on the Marsh property. The official record also said the case had been reviewed and closed. The word on the file, according to the copy Cal had eventually obtained through a cousin who worked in the next county's records office, was a single word: archived. Not resolved. Not concluded. Archived. As if the life of a working man in Harlan County were something that could simply be put away in a drawer when it became inconvenient. The community's version of the story had several variations, the way community stories always do when no one has been given an authoritative account. Some people said Virgil had left. Some said he had gotten into trouble with people he owed money to. Some said there had been a work accident and the family had been paid to stay quiet. Each version circulated in its own small orbit of credibility, and none of them were ever compared to each other, because that's not how small communities manage uncertainty. You hold your version. Your neighbor holds theirs. Nobody compares notes. Cal had compared notes. He had started the notebook explained with something Opal Winters said at a community meeting the previous October. He didn't describe it as a dramatic moment. He wrote it plainly. Opal said that Mary Ferris told her Virgil had come to her in a dream, said the ground above him was wrong. Then a gap of 2 lines. Then not that he was buried. That the ground was wrong. Like he knew the place was off. That distinction between being somewhere and being in the wrong somewhere had caught in him like a burr. He did not explain in the notebook why it caught. He didn't have to. She understood it. Cal was a man who noticed the difference between what people said and what they meant by it. And when those two things diverged, he could not unnotice it. It was the same quality that had made him a careful farmer and a decent neighbor and a difficult son. He could not look away from what was actually there. So he had pulled the thread. He had called his cousin at the records office. He had visited Mary Ferris at her house on the pretext of an old acquaintance stopping by, and then he had listened. Really listened to the way she talked about the land near the eastern fence line of the Marsh property, the strip that had always been disputed that Virgil had called his since before Everett was born. He had driven to the next county and found Everett Ferris in a rented room behind someone else's house, and he had sat at that man's table and shown him what he'd found and asked him what he knew. He had found the document. Royce Marsh had registered a parcel of land 60 acres in the northeast quadrant of the Marsh holdings. 60 acres that had not previously been part of the Marsh holdings, 14 days after Virgil Ferris was last seen. The registration had been done properly, all the paperwork in order, all the signatures in the right places. There was nothing irregular about the filing itself. The irregularity was what the filing did not mention, that 60 acres of that land had been claimed by Virgil Ferris for years before the registration, that he had documentation supporting his claim, and that he had been scheduled to bring that documentation to the county office the Monday after he disappeared. He had disappeared on a Friday night. Cal wrote about his father with the same precision he wrote about everything else. No rage, no shouting on the page, just the facts documented with the care of a man who understood that facts to matter have to be exact. Dad did this. I don't know exactly how, and I don't know who else was in it with him, but the sequence is clear. The land registration, the timing, the closed case file. I've looked at it from every angle I can find, and there's only one way the pieces fit together. And then a page later, the line that made her close the notebook for a moment and press the heels of both hands against her eyes. I don't understand how Dad did this. I don't want to understand. But someone needs to know. Because if I keep silent the way he has, then I am the same as him, and that I cannot carry. She sat in the dark with the notebook closed in her lap, and she breathed. She thought about the man who had written that. She thought about what it cost to put those words on a page, to say plainly, and without self-pity. My father did something unforgivable, and I know about it, and I cannot stay quiet. She thought about all the ways that a man raised inside a family like the Marsh family learns over decades to look away from what the family does. How that looking away becomes automatic. How it becomes identity. And what it means to finally really look and write down what you see. She thought about the last year of their marriage, the wall he had built between them. She had thought it was about her, about something she had done or failed to do. She understood now that he had been protecting her. Not well. Not in a way that left her with any say in the matter. But that was what it was. He had been building a case in a limestone cave in the hills above Harlan County, and he had kept her out of it because whatever happened to him, he did not want it to happen to her. He was wrong to do it that way. She had decided that somewhere in the third hour of reading, and she stayed decided. He was wrong to make that choice without her. But she could hold that alongside the other thing, that he had done it because the alternative to him was unthinkable. She opened the notebook again and kept reading. Several entries later, buried in the careful chronology of his investigation, she found the passage she did not know she was looking for. He had written about going to the White Oak himself alone on a November afternoon when the light failed early and nobody would have seen him cross the fence line. The entry was dated 2 weeks into his investigation, after he had already visited Mary Ferris and driven to find Everett and obtained the land registration copy from his cousin. He had gone to the eastern boundary of the property on an afternoon when Glendon was in town and Royce was in the next county on business. He had known where to look because he had read the original land dispute filings and understood what Virgil was claiming and where the claim was centered. He had found the canvas bundle in the third place he tried, wedged between a root and the soil on the north side of the White Oak, exactly where a man who hid things in the side, where the shadow fell latest, would have put it. Inside the bundle, documents in a craft paper envelope, and underneath them, sealed in a Ziploc bag, a small digital recorder. He had taken the recorder. He had left the documents exactly where they were. His reasoning, written in the same careful hand as everything else, was exact documents found in their original location by the family member with direct legal standing, carried more evidentiary weight than documents that had passed through other hands. The chain of custody mattered. If it ever came to a legal proceeding, and he intended for it to come to one, or for someone after him to bring it there, Everett Ferris needed to be the one who retrieved his father's papers from the place his father had hidden them. The recorder was different. The recorder he had brought here to the cave and cleaned and resealed in a fresh bag with a new battery from the hardware store in town. He had listened to it in this chamber alone with the candle burning down. He had not written down what he heard. He had not needed to. He had understood from the first seconds of the recording what it was and what it meant and what it changed. And he had made sure it would be waiting. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about him in this chamber, this specific room, this same cold floor, holding the recorder and pressing play, and hearing a dead man's voice explain the terms of his own disappearance. She thought about what that must have been like to hear alone in the dark, with no one to turn to. She thought about coming home after that and sitting across the dinner table from his father and passing the salt. She thought he was braver than I knew. And then she thought he should have told me. And then she held both of those things at the same time, which was the only honest way to hold them. She opened the notebook again and kept reading. The 3 sheets of paper told the rest of it in the flat language of official documents, which is its own kind of indictment. The first was a copy of the land registration, parcel numbers, coordinates, date, Royce Marsh's signature. The second was the police report on Virgil Ferris. 1 page. His name, the date he was last seen, the location given as the eastern section of the Marsh property. The resolution field had 1 word in it: archived. The third was a list of names, 5 of them written by hand in handwriting she didn't recognize, not Cal's, not anyone's she could place. The third name was Royce Marsh. The fourth name was Glendon Marsh. And the fifth name, the last name on the list, was Calhoun Marsh. Written out in full and then crossed through, hard, with a different pen. The strokes of the crossing out went over the name, twice pressing into the paper. She looked at that for a long time. He had put his own name on that list, and then he had crossed it out, not because he was denying what he knew, not because he wanted to hide from it. She understood this with the clarity of knowing a person in the specific way you know someone. After 12 years, he had crossed his name out because he was removing himself from their number. He was saying in the private language of a document no one was supposed to find, "I am not one of them. I refuse to be one of them." That act of crossing out his own name was the bravest thing she had ever seen him do. And it had probably been the thing that got him killed. She picked up the recorder. It was a Sony model small enough to fit inside a closed fist. She pressed the power button. The battery light came on. He had put a fresh battery in it before he sealed the bag. She pressed play. 2 seconds of silence. Then a voice. Then 2 voices. One she didn't recognize at first, an older man's voice, measured, and certain the voice of someone accustomed to being the one who sets the terms. The other voice she did not recognize either, but it was different in quality. A working man's voice, careful. A little formal, the way people get formal when they're in a room with someone who has more power than they do. She listened. The conversation was about land, about the parcel on the eastern fence line, about what it would take for the second man to sign over his claim. There were numbers. There was a timeline. And then, after what sounded like a pen on paper, after what she understood to be the sound of a signature being made, the first voice said something that changed the temperature of the air in that small chamber. "Virgil, you understand that this settles everything. Permanently." And Virgil Ferris, who did not understand what permanently meant in the mouth of the man sitting across from him, said, "Yes, sir. I understand." There was a click. The recording ended. She sat with the device in her hand for a long time after the silence came back. She pressed play again and listened to the whole thing a second time more carefully. The first voice, the one that had said permanently, did not identify itself by name. But the district attorney would eventually send the recording to a forensic audio laboratory in Louisville, where a technician would compare the voice patterns to publicly available recordings of county commissioners' meetings, and the match would come back at 94.7%. The voice belonged to Horace Dunbar, the man whose name appeared on the document as a witness to the agreement. The commissioner who had signed his name to a paper at the bottom of which Virgil Ferris also signed. Not understanding that the document meant nothing and that the signing of it was the last significant thing he would do. Virgil Ferris had known something was wrong. He had turned on the recorder before the meeting started. He had set it in a pocket or under a paper or somewhere that would pick up the conversation, and he had let it run. And when it was over, he had kept the recording and buried it under the roots of the white oak on the eastern edge of a property that had once been partly his. Cal had found it. Cal had brought it here. And for 9 years before that, and nearly 1 more year after that small silver device had been waiting for someone to press play in the right room. She did not sleep well the second night. The sounds of the cave moved through her half-sleep like visitors she hadn't invited. The slow drip of water deeper in the rock. A sudden sharp sound like the limestone. Settling something near the entrance that could have been a bat, or could have been the wind, or could have been her own fear. Taking a shape her exhausted mind could give form to. She lay on her coat on the floor of the main chamber and stared at the ceiling and did not let herself think too hard about any one thing. Thinking too hard about any one thing would require deciding what to do. and she was not ready yet. She needed to be ready. The sound of the truck came close to midnight. It was on the road below the ridge. She could hear it because the night was still enough. And the valley carries sound in a particular way when there's no wind. A truck moving slowly, much more slowly than anyone who knew where they were going. It stopped somewhere down below for 2 or 3 minutes, and then started again. And then the sound of the engine faded east along the road. She lay still and breathed. She told herself it was someone looking for a property line in the dark. She told herself it was a neighbor, out late for ordinary reasons. She told herself 3 things that might be true. And then she listened for the truck to come back, and it didn't. And eventually, she slept. In the morning, she went down to Miller's Creek before first light to fill the bottle she had in the suitcase. The creek ran clear this time of year. She drank from it with her hands, and then filled the bottle and climbed back up the trail toward the cave. She stopped on the trail, in the mud beside the path where the ground was soft from the previous week's rain. There were tire tracks, wide. The tread pattern pressed sharp and clean into the mud, the kind of tread you see on trucks that have new tires, not the worn, half-smooth track of the vehicles that belong to the farms around here. Around here, people ran their tires until the tread was gone and then ran them a little further. These tires were new. Someone had driven off the road and onto the path last night. Someone in a truck with money for new tires. She looked at the tracks for a long moment. Then she went back into the cave. On the 3rd day, she climbed up onto the flat rock shelf above the cave entrance in the late morning to dry the 1 pair of wool socks she had washed in the creek. She was crouching behind a stand of mountain laurel when she saw them. 2 men on the trail below. One older heavyset moving with the deliberate economy of someone who spent time outdoors, not by choice, but by profession. The other younger, thinner, looking at his phone every 30 seconds with the expression of a man who knows there's no signal, but keeps checking anyway. Neither of them moved like people from around here. People from around here read the ground when they walk. These 2 were reading the middle distance, looking for a landmark someone had described to them. They stopped at the fork in the trail. The older one talked. The younger one listened, and then pointed twice in the direction of the ridge. Norma did not breathe deeply while they were down there. She breathed small, the kind of breathing fear teaches without a lesson. After 10 minutes, they turned around and went back down. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she climbed down from the rock shelf and went back inside. She sat in the inner chamber with the notebook in her lap and the 3 documents beside her and the recorder in her hand. And she thought for a long time. Not about what she knew she had finished that thinking. About what to do with what she knew. Cal had built this. He had come here probably a dozen times or more in the last year of his life, and he had assembled the case and put it in a tin and buried the tin under rocks in the back of a cave that nobody used. And then he had written on the wall outside because he needed to leave something visible, something that could be read by anyone who happened to look. He had done all of that knowing that what he was holding was dangerous, and that the people it implicated had the resources to make a problem go away. He had done all of that. And then he had died of a massive cardiac event at 52 years old. She thought about that for a while. She thought about it until the thought settled into a place in her chest that felt like stone. Then she started thinking about Everett Ferris. She left the cave before dawn on the fourth day. The trail was wet with night damp, and the red clay stuck to the soles of her bare feet in sheets. She had put the documents and the recorder into the inside pocket of her coat close against her body, and she was carrying the suitcase in one hand and using the other hand to keep branches out of her face in the dark. The moon was full and just above the western ridge, throwing thin silver light through the canopy enough to see shapes, but not details, enough to not fall. She came down out of the hills and onto the county road, and she walked east along the shoulder for 3 miles. The light began coming up behind her, the eastern sky going through its sequence dark blue, then violet, then the slow bleeding of color. That means morning is committing to itself. In all the years she had lived in Harlan County, she had seen this transition maybe a handful of times. It was the kind of thing that happened while most people were still asleep, and she understood now that was a loss. There was something about the sky deciding to be day that clarified a person. Something about being the one who watched it happen. Clover Creek was a small settlement, rather than a proper town. A post office, a gas station, a church, and a scatter of houses and trailers on the roads that ran back into the hollows. Everett Ferris lived in a rented room behind a house at the end of one of those roads in a structure that had started its life as a storage building and been converted with the addition of a door and 2 windows and a propane heater to something that could be called charitably an apartment. There was a light on inside. Norma knocked on the door. She heard footsteps, slow, careful, the footsteps of someone not yet fully convinced the day had started. The door opened. Everett Ferris was 25 years old and looked like a man who had grown up in a hurry and never quite finished the job. Tall, with his father's working man's build still coming in his face, carrying the early morning heaviness of someone interrupted in the middle of the only rest they were going to get. He looked at her without recognition, which made sense. They had never met. Everett Ferris. Yeah. My name is Norma Marsh. I was Calhoun Marsh's wife. His face did not change dramatically, but something behind his eyes woke up. The kind of waking that happens when a name lands in a place that's been waiting for it. "Come in," he said. He made coffee without asking if she wanted any. He set 2 cups on the table and sat down across from her, and folded his hands and waited. He didn't ask why she was barefoot, or why she looked like she hadn't slept in 3 days in a cave. Because he was from Harlan County, and he understood that sometimes people arrive at your door carrying the visible evidence of something that is not yet ready to be explained. You give them coffee. You wait. She told him what she had found. She laid the notebook on the table, and she told him what was in it. She showed him the document with his father's name in the heading and the word archived in the resolution field. She showed him the list with the crossed-out name. And then she opened the notebook to the last page where Cal had drawn his map. And she put her finger on the circle he had drawn around the eastern parcel, and on the words he had written inside it. The old white oak. Deep roots. The white oak. Everett read it twice. He closed his eyes. "My dad told me about that tree," he said. The words came out carefully, like he was moving something fragile from one place to another. "Last time we talked before he disappeared, he told me he had buried some papers near it. That if anything happened to him, they'd be there. For when someone finally came looking." The phrase sat in the room between them. For when someone finally came looking. as if Virgil Ferris had known sitting across a table from a man named Horace Dunbar, signing a document with a pen that belonged to someone else, that what came after would require waiting, that the only question was how long. She showed him the recorder. She pressed play. She watched his face while his father's voice came out of the small silver device and filled the room. Everett Ferris sat very still while he listened. His hands were flat on the table. He did not move for the full length of the recording. When it ended, he exhaled once carefully through his nose. "That's him," he said. "That's my dad's voice." "I know," she said. "There are documents still under that tree. Cal left them there on purpose. He wanted you to be the one to find them. He wrote that the chain of custody mattered, that it had to be you." Everett looked at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not surprise, not grief exactly. The expression of a man who has just been handed back something he thought was gone permanently. "By yourself," he said finally. "I don't have anything left to lose," she said. It was a true statement, and she said it plainly without drama. "They took my house. They took my husband. The only way they can take anything else from me is if I still have something. And now I do." She put her hand on the notebook. "So the calculation has changed." He looked at her for a long time. Then he pushed back from the table. "I'm going with you," he said. They went by the creek path, staying inside the tree line that ran parallel to the main road. Everett knew the back way. He had grown up in these hills, and the land was in his feet the way it gets into people who spend their childhoods in it. They moved without speaking at a pace set by the terrain and by the shared understanding that they were doing something that could not be undone and needed to be done right. The white oaks stood at the eastern boundary of the marsh property 100 yards inside the fence line, in a break in the tree cover, where a limestone shelf ran close to the surface, and nothing else could get a root down deep enough to compete with it. The tree was enormous, 3 or 4 feet across. At the base, the bark deeply furrowed and gray-brown, the crown spreading wide enough to shade a significant piece of ground. It had been here long before anyone now living had been anything. It would be here long after. The roots surfaced at intervals around the base, thick as a man's thigh, in places creating ridges and hollows in the ground that you learned to step around without thinking about it. Everett went around the tree once. He stopped on the north side where one of the major roots came up at a sharp angle from the ground before diving back down, creating a wedge of shadow and enclosed space against the earth. "Here," he said. He always hid things on the side where the shadow falls latest. He said it was the most private. Norma turned her back to the tree and faced the direction of the farm buildings. She could not see them through the tree line, but she could feel the direction of them. She listened. Everett crouched at the base of the root and began working the soil with the pocket knife he'd brought. The ground was hard from the dry September, but looser here than the surrounding soil. The root had opened it over the years, kept it from compacting the way the surface around it had. He dug carefully, keeping the cuts small. The morning was still and bright. Insects in the grass. Somewhere across the fields a crow called once and was quiet. She heard the engine. It came from inside the property, from the back farm road that ran through the eastern wood lot, the one the family used for moving equipment between the fields. It was a truck, and it was moving at the speed of a vehicle that knew where it was going. Everett. She kept her voice level. "I know. Almost." The engine was getting louder. The back farm road curved through the woods and came out into the open about 200 yards from where they were standing. If the truck came all the way out, the driver would see them. Everett. Now. It's caught on something the root. The engine sound changed, slowing the way a truck changes when the driver is scanning the ground around him. Now, right now, a sharp sound, something giving way underground. Then the sound of displaced earth and the impact of a hand on packed dirt. Everett's arm came up out of the ground, and in his fist was a bundle wrapped in dark canvas and tied with baling twine about the size of a small book. They stood up together. They moved into the trees on the creekside, not running, moving with the quick and deliberate efficiency of people who have made a decision and are executing it. Branches caught at her arms. The ground was uneven, and she stumbled once and corrected without going down. Behind them, she heard the truck stop. She heard a door. She heard voices, two of them talking, and she kept moving and did not look back. They went a quarter of a mile before they stopped. They stopped because the voices had faded completely, and because Everett's breathing needed a moment, and because Norma's hands, she noticed now, that she had a moment to notice, were shaking. Not from fear. Not exactly. From the understanding arriving fully now of what they were carrying. They sat on a flat rock beside the creek. Everett undid the baling twine. He folded back the canvas. Inside was a craft paper envelope, the brown kind, sealed and still holding its shape despite the years in the ground. He opened it. 4 documents. The signed agreement. Virgil Ferris's signature on one line, the Marsh representatives on another, 2 witnesses below that, Horace Dunbar's name among them. The property map with the disputed parcel outlined in red ink. The unpaid receipt with Glendon Marsh's signature on the guarantor line, the payment date long past the amount written in Virgil's careful hand. And a letter. Everett unfolded it. He held it with both hands. His hands were steadier than hers had been, which she noticed because she was watching him with the attention she gave to things that mattered. He read it without speaking. When he got to the end, he stayed with it for another moment. Then he folded it very carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the water going past over the stones. He knew, Everett said. His voice was the voice of someone who has been a long time in a room with something and is only now saying its name. He wrote that he knew it might not go well, that if something happened to him, nobody should blame anyone because he understood the risk. He paused. He said he went anyway because he couldn't look at me and Denny and stay quiet. The creek moved past them doing what water does, going where gravity directs it without preference or grievance. Patient and constant and entirely indifferent to the weight of what was being understood on its bank. Norma looked at the documents in her hands. She thought about Cal in the cave with his notebook. She thought about Virgil Ferris sitting across a table from Horace Dunbar with a small silver recorder running in his pocket. She thought about what it means to be the kind of person who cannot stay quiet, the cost of it, and the alternative, which is also a cost just paid differently and over longer. There's a district attorney in the county seat, she said. Cal wrote her name in the back of the notebook. He put a star next to it. Everett looked at her. 1 star or more than 1. He considered this. Cal wasn't a man who wasted marks. No, she said. He wasn't. She put the documents back in the envelope. She put the envelope inside her coat against her body next to the notebook and the recorder. She stood up. Her feet were cold from the rock and her back ached from the cave floor, and her arms had a dozen small cuts from the branches, and she realized, hungry, in a way she had not let herself notice until this moment. She started walking. Glendon Marsh was standing beside his truck when they came out of the tree line. He was not hiding. He was not moving toward them. He was simply there at the gate that opened onto the back farm road, where it met the county easement, one hand resting on the door of the truck, the other at his side. 72 years old, and built the way men get built, when they have spent their lives in the conviction that the world arranges itself around them. His white hair was combed back from his forehead. His shirt was tucked in. He looked like a man who had decided some time ago that there was no situation that required him to appear unprepared. Norma stopped. Everett stopped beside her. For a moment, nobody said anything. The morning light was fully up now, coming in at a low angle through the trees, and it caught the dust on the truck's windshield and the dew still on the grass, and made everything look more ordinary than it was. Birds in the canopy, a tractor running somewhere in the far distance, the sound of it a steady pulse underneath everything else. Glendon looked at Norma first. The look he gave her was one she recognized. She had been on the receiving end of some version of it for 12 years. The look of a man who has assessed you and found the assessment reassuring. Not contemptuous exactly. Something worse than contempt. Comfortable. The look of someone who has never had to update what they think about you, because you have never until this moment given them a reason to. Norma, he said. His voice was the voice of the county, not unkind, not warm, just certain. The voice of a man who sets the terms. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. She looked at him. She thought about 12 years of looking at him across tables, of handing him coffee cups, of sitting in rooms where he talked about the land and the county and what was owed to whom in the particular way of a man who has never seriously considered the possibility of being wrong. She thought about Cal in the cave, writing in a composition notebook in the dark, cutting words into limestone, because the walls of his own house had ears that weren't his. You had a man killed Glendon, she said, not as an accusation, as a statement of fact. The way you state a fact when you are reading it off a document and the document is clear. Over 60 acres. Something shifted in his face, but only for a moment, and only in the eyes. Virgil Ferris had an accident. Virgil Ferris signed a contract, she said, and was dead before the payment came due. She put her hand on the outside of her coat over the place where the envelope was, and he recorded the conversation. The thing that moved through Glendon Marsh's expression in the 3 seconds after she said that was not what she had expected. She had expected anger or denial, or the performance of confusion. What she saw instead was calculation. The gears of a mind that had been solving problems of this type for 40 years turning, reassessing, looking for the angle. He was a man who had been in difficult situations before and had always found the exit. He was looking for the exit now. She watched him look, and she watched the moment he did not find it. Then he looked at Everett. Everett Ferris stood with his hands at his sides and his feet at shoulder width, and his eyes on Glendon Marsh with the stillness of a man who has been waiting for this particular moment for 9 years, without letting himself know he was waiting for it. He was 25 years old, and he had grown up in the aftermath of what this man had done in the specific poverty of a family that has lost its anchor in the space his father's disappearance had carved out and never filled. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "My father's name was Virgil James Ferris," Everett said. He was 45 years old. He was trying to give his family a future. And you buried him. The words were plain. They were the plainest words in the world. And because they were plain, because there was nothing theatrical in them, no performance, just a young man saying what was true, they landed differently than a speech would have landed. They landed like a stone put down on a table, something that does not move once it has been set. Glendon Marsh looked at Everett Ferris for a long moment. Then he looked away. That was the moment, not the hearing that came later, not the documents laid on a government desk, not the names that appeared in the county paper the following month. This was the moment that mattered here on a dirt track at the edge of a field in Harlan County, Kentucky in the early morning of a September day. The most powerful man in the scene looked away from the youngest, could not hold it, looked at the middle distance instead, at nothing at the safe gray space of not having to see what was in front of him. "You're going to want to be careful," Glendon said finally. His voice was still controlled. A man like that does not lose control of his voice. You don't know what you're getting into. Norma looked at him. She looked at him for a long time, the way you look at something you have lived alongside for years, and are only now seeing clearly. The face she had looked at across dinner tables. The face she had said good morning to and good night to and never really looked at. Because you stop looking at things that are just part of the architecture. "I know exactly what I'm getting into," she said. "I spent 12 years inside your house." She let that sit. Then she said, "I'm finishing what your son started." She walked toward the gate. Glendon did not move to stop her. He did not move at all. He stood with his hand on the door of his truck, and he watched them go. And he did not try to stop them, because he had spent 40 years in a county where his name was enough. And some part of him, the oldest and most fundamental part, still believed that would be true this time too. He was wrong. But he wouldn't know how wrong for another 6 months.
Cassie.
The bus to the county seat ran once in the morning and once in the afternoon, and they were at the stop on the state highway by 9 o'clock, with 40 minutes to wait. Everett had a bag with him. He had stopped at his room on the way down from the hills to get it. And Norma had her suitcase and her coat, and what was inside her coat. They sat on the bench at the stop and did not talk much. There was a comfortable quality to the silence. It was the silence of people who have been through something together and have not yet started the work of describing it. The bus was a county transit vehicle, old, the seat fabric worn through to the foam on the aisle seats. It smelled of diesel and the particular staleness of upholstered spaces that carry people who have somewhere they need to be. They sat in the middle of the bus and watched Harlan County go past through the windows, the hills folding and unfolding the houses set back from the road, the occasional boarded storefront in the small settlements. They passed through the dollar stores and the tire shops and the church signs that changed their messages weekly, in the hope that the right combination of words would finally reach whoever needed reaching. She thought about Opal Winters for most of that ride. She thought about the specificity of what Opal had told her at the funeral. Not just that there was a cave, but where it was. The creek, the ridge, the brush that hid the entrance, the kind of directions that come from someone who has been there or has heard a very detailed account from someone who has. Harold Winters had been on the mine management board for the northern Harlan County operations in the 1990s and early 2000s. She knew this vaguely the way you know background facts about the lives of people you see every few weeks for years, without ever asking them directly about themselves. Harold Winters had known Glendon Marsh, had sat in rooms with Glendon Marsh, had known exactly what kind of arrangements the Marsh family made and how those arrangements were structured and who was in them. And Harold had told his wife. Before he died, he had told Opal something, maybe not everything, but enough. And Opal had held it and watched and waited with the patience of a woman who tends a garden and understands that some things cannot be rushed and that the right conditions for a thing to grow are specific and cannot be manufactured. She had watched Cal making his trips up the back road toward the quarry ridge in the last year of his life. She had understood what he was doing. And when he died and Norma was standing in a kitchen full of funeral guests, Opal had come and found her and handed her the coordinates of the next thing without explaining why. Because she knew who would walk through the door of that cave and who wouldn't. Because she had been watching long enough to know the difference. Jaya, the county seat, was a town of about 12,000 people. The kind of regional hub that has a courthouse and a hospital and a Walmart, and not much else that you couldn't find in 3 other towns just like it within 50 miles. The district attorney's office was on the 2nd floor of the county administration building, a 70s-era brick structure with the architectural ambition of a shoebox. The air conditioner in one of the 2nd-floor windows was dripping onto the sidewalk below, leaving a dark stain on the concrete that had been there long enough to become part of the landscape. The nameplate beside the stairwell door said, District Attorney, and below that in smaller letters, Greta Holt. They waited on a bench in the hallway for 2 hours. The bench was molded plastic, the pale orange color of institutional furniture from a period when someone had tried to make institutional spaces less depressing and succeeded only in making them depressing in a different way. Everett sat with his elbows on his knees. Norma sat straight with the notebook in her hands, and the envelope inside her coat, and the recorder in her coat pocket. She had not put them down or set them aside since the rock shelf by the creek. She was not going to put them down until they were on someone else's desk. The door at the end of the hall opened. The woman who came out was in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back without ceremony glasses with thin metal frames. The face of someone who reads a great deal and has developed over years of reading things that should not have been written and often should not have happened. A default expression of careful neutrality. She looked at the hallway. She looked at the 2 people on the bench. Who's next? Us Norma said. Greta Holt's office was the organized kind of small, every surface was occupied. But nothing was in the wrong place, and the occupation had clearly been stable long enough that it had stopped being noticed. She sat behind her desk and she gestured at the 2 chairs across from it, and she picked up a pen. Tell me, she said. Norma told her. She did not perform it. She did not arrange it for effect. She told it the way Cal had written his notebook in sequence, with attention to what was known, and what was inferred, and what was documented. The Ferris land claim, The signed agreement, the disappeared man and the closed file, and the 60 acres that ended up in Royce Marsh's name 14 days later. Cal's investigation, conducted over almost a year of trips to a limestone cave in the hills, while his wife slept in the house below, and thought he was going away from her. The notebook, the documents, the recorder. She put the recorder on the desk when she got to that part. Greta Holt looked at it. This contains a recorded conversation. Yes, Virgil Ferris recorded it without anyone knowing. The other voice in the recording, we believe it's Horace Dunbar. Greta Holt did not respond to that immediately. She wrote something. Then she looked up. You understand this will be difficult. The Marsh family has had influence in this county for a long time. I know who they are, Norma said. I spent 12 years inside their house. A pause. Greta Holt's pen was still. She was looking at Norma with the particular quality of attention that reads a person through everything they do, and not just what they say, through the way they are sitting, the way they are holding the thing in their hands. The distance between what they are saying and what it cost them to be in this room saying it. Your husband discovered all of this, Greta said, and died before he could bring it forward. Yes, and you're here. It was not a question. It was an acknowledgement of the fact of her presence, which contained everything that needed to be said about why she was there. The answer to it was the suitcase beside the chair, and the bare feet in the wrong shoes, and the documents held against her body for 2 days like something she was keeping warm. I'm finishing what he started, Norma said. Greta Holt held her gaze for a moment. Then she pulled the recorder toward her. Leave everything on the table, she said. Both of you. I want written statements before you leave today. The 6 months that followed were not clean. Nothing of this kind is ever clean. She had understood that in the abstract, and she came to understand it more specifically as the weeks went on. The Marsh family retained 2 attorneys from Lexington men who wore suits that had been made for them and who filed motions with the fluency of people for whom this kind of filing is ordinary work. There were procedural challenges. There were arguments about how the recording had been obtained and whether it constituted admissible evidence. There were delays and continuances and rescheduled hearings. The county paper ran a profile of Glendon Marsh in October. The headline called him a pillar. The article discussed his contributions to the county agricultural board, his family's long history in Harlan County, the scholarships the Marsh Family Trust had funded at the regional high school. It ran with a photograph of him that had been taken at a county fair 3 years earlier, standing in front of a barn in good light. He looked exactly like what 40 years of careful image management had made him look like. Norma read the article at the kitchen table of the small house she was renting on the east side of Clover Creek. 3 rooms, a propane heater, windows that needed caulking. She read it through once, and then she set it down and went to put the kettle on. She found the stones on the trail below the cave in early November. Someone had placed a row of them across the path, not a natural formation, not a landslide. Stones selected and arranged with intent. A line across the path that meant, we know you come here. We know where you go. She stepped over the stones and kept walking. There were 2 nights in November when she did not sleep well, when the sounds outside the small house arranged themselves into patterns that might have been innocent and might not have been. And she lay in the dark, listening and not reaching a conclusion. Everett got a phone call at 2 in the morning in early December. Silence on the line for 10 seconds. Then, nothing. He told her about it the next day at the kitchen table over coffee, in the matter-of-fact way of someone reporting a weather event. She made a note of the date and the time and gave it to Greta Holt. In the course of the investigation, Greta Holt's office identified 2 men who had been paid to survey the Quarry Ridge area in September. Contractors with no prior record hired through a third party that traced back to Royce Marsh. They had not found what they were looking for. They had not come back. The identification of those 2 men became part of the supplemental evidence package filed in January. Greta Holt was the kind of prosecutor who does not let go. She was not dramatic about it. She did not appear in the paper. She did not give statements. She worked. She sent the recorder to a forensic audio laboratory in Louisville, the kind of facility that does comparison analysis for federal cases and doesn't speculate. The results came back in December. The voice in the recording matched the voice of Horace Dunbar, and publicly available recordings of county commissioner meetings to a confidence level of 94.7%. Below the results, the technician had written a single-sentence note in the margin of the report. Matching characteristics are consistent across multiple phonemic patterns and are not attributable to coincidence. That was enough. The hearing was held in February in the county courthouse on the main square of the county seat. The room was a standard administrative hearing room. Not a courtroom exactly, smaller with rows of folding chairs for the public, and a long table at the front where the commissioners of inquiry sat. It was not a trial. It was a formal proceeding which in some ways was more damaging than a trial because it had a different kind of audience and a different kind of record. Norma sat in the second row. Everett sat beside her. Mary Ferris was there in the back of the room, a woman in her late 60s, now small and still, who had come alone on the early bus and would go home alone on the late one, and who sat through the entire proceeding without changing her expression, as if she had rehearsed composure for 9 years and had it down. Glendon Marsh sat at the respondent's table in a gray suit. His attorneys flanked him. His back was straight and his hands were folded on the table in front of him, and he looked from where Norma sat exactly like he had always looked, like a man who had decided a long time ago that the world would accommodate itself to his preferences. Winifred was not there. Royce was there at a separate table with his own attorney. The proceeding moved through its formal stages. The presentation of evidence, the reading of the document, record the testimony from the forensic audio expert who had flown in from Louisville and who spoke in the precise, dispassionate language of his field. When the recording was played through the room's speaker system, Virgil Ferris's voice came out of it with a clarity that had no right to exist after 9 years in the ground. His words, his careful formality with the man across the table from him, and then Horace Dunbar's voice saying the sentence that ended everything. This settles everything. Permanently. In the folding chairs, a few people looked at their hands. Glendon Marsh sat straight. He sat straight through the audio comparison analysis. He sat straight through the presentation of the land registration documents. He sat straight, while his brother's attorney made procedural objections that were noted for the record and overruled. He sat straight through all of it, with the discipline of a man who has spent his life understanding that composure is a form of power, and that losing composure in public is a form of defeat. And then, Greta Holt looked at him. She looked at him for a moment after the last piece of documentary evidence had been entered into the record in the brief silence before she addressed the panel. She looked at him the way you look at something you are about to put a name to. And Glendon Marsh looked away. Not for long. 2 seconds, maybe 3. His eyes went to the left, to the middle distance, to the safe gray space of not having to see what was in front of him. Then they came back. But those 2 or 3 seconds were the longest seconds in that room, and the people who noticed them, and several people did, carried the weight of them for a long time afterward. It was not the sound of a verdict that mattered. It was that. The outcomes came over the following weeks in the impersonal language of legal findings. Glendon Marsh was formally indicted on charges of obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. Royce Marsh was indicted on charges of filing fraudulent property documents. Horace Dunbar was removed from office by emergency county resolution and referred for criminal prosecution. A fourth man, a former deputy whose name had appeared on the archive case file, was placed under investigation. The newspaper coverage this time was different. The 60 acres were placed in a legal hold pending the resolution of the property fraud claim. The resolution, when it came 4 months later, transferred the parcel back to the estate of Virgil James Ferris to be administered on behalf of his surviving heirs. Winifred Marsh did not attend the hearing and was never charged. She remained in the house on the Marsh property, which was now managed by attorneys handling the estate pending the civil proceedings. People who saw her in those months said she had stopped talking very much. Not from guilt, by the look of her, from the particular silence of a person who has outlived the story they told about themselves and does not yet have another one to take its place. The house that had never been Norma's remained Winifred's in name. But a name on a deed, it turned out, was not the same as a home, and Winifred Marsh was old enough and sharp enough to understand the difference, even if she had never chosen to apply that understanding to anyone other than herself. In the spring, a crew with ground-penetrating equipment went over the eastern section of the former disputed parcel. They worked for 2 days. On the second afternoon, they found what they found, and a Harlan County Sheriff's deputy called Mary Ferris at her house near the creek. And Mary Ferris sat down in her kitchen chair and did not get up for a long time. Virgil Ferris came home in a manner that no one would have chosen. But he came home. He was not somewhere else. He had not left them. He had done exactly what he said he would do, and what had been done to him had been done to him by people who believed that the land and the silence of a county could cover anything. They had been wrong. It had just taken 9 years, and a woman with a paring knife and a tin box in a limestone cave to prove it. Everett sold 20 of the 60 acres. The price was fair. He had Greta Holt recommend a surveyor who was not connected to anyone connected to the Marsh family. And the surveyor found a buyer who was not from the county and had no history in its arrangements. With the money, he bought a reliable used truck and enrolled in the evening law program at the community college in Lexington. It was a 4-year program if you took it at the pace designed for people who worked during the day, which he did. He drove the 80 miles each way 3 nights a week without complaint. He told Norma about the law school enrollment on an afternoon in late March. Sitting on the porch of her rented house with 2 cups of coffee, the air still cold, but the light beginning to have some warmth in it. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without setup, as if it were a simple fact, rather than a decision that had reorganized something fundamental in how he understood his own life. "My dad never got to see us have a future," he said, "so I'm gonna build one where he can't miss it." She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything adequate to say. She just looked at him, this young man who had been 16 years old when his father disappeared and had carried that disappearance for 9 years, in the specific way that children carry the losses they're given before they're old enough to name them. And she thought about what it means to decide at 25 that the story does not end where someone else tried to end it. His brother Denny came up from the southern part of the county that spring. The two of them moved into the house on the Ferris parcel, the old house that Mary and Virgil had lived in, that had sat empty since Mary had moved to her sister's place after Virgil disappeared. They cleaned it out. They fixed the roof. For the first time since they were children, the two Ferris brothers lived in a house that was actually theirs. Yeah, Norma's house on the east side of Clover Creek was not much. 3 rooms, the propane heater, the windows that let in drafts until she weather-stripped them herself in October, a porch that got the afternoon sun, a small yard that she had not done anything with yet, though she was thinking about a garden in the spring. Her neighbor 2 doors down was a retired miner who kept chickens, and she had worked out an arrangement with him eggs in exchange for help with his paperwork, which he found baffling. It was the kind of arrangement that Harlan County runs on. Small, practical, human-scaled. Cal's wedding photograph was on the wall of the main room. She had taken it out of the suitcase the day she moved in, and she had put it up before she unpacked anything else. Not as a memorial, exactly, and not as a wound kept open. More like a compass point, a way of orienting herself in the room. The locket with her mother's photograph was on the nightstand. She worked 3 days a week for a small farm operation 10 miles east, doing the kind of bookkeeping and general organizing that farm operations run by people who are good at farming but not at paperwork require. It was enough. Enough was what she had. She was finding that enough, when it was genuinely yours, occupied a different space in you than abundance that isn't. She thought about Cal in the ordinary moments, not with the acute pain of the early weeks, but with something quieter and more continuous. The way you think about a person who has become part of how you understand the world, not constantly, but as a background frequency. The frame you look through without knowing you're looking through it. She understood now what the last year of his life had been. She understood it completely, and with a clarity that had not been available to her while she was living inside it. He had been protecting her. He had been wrong to do it the way he did. She stayed sure of that. He had made a decision about what she could bear, without asking her, and that was a kind of arrogance, even if it came from love, even if the love was genuine and large. She had a right to know. She had a right to choose. He had taken that from her, and she did not pretend otherwise. But she held that alongside the other thing. The man who had walked into that cave alone with the knowledge of what his family had done, and the knowledge of what that knowledge might cost him, and had sat in the cold and the dark, and written it down anyway because he could not make himself be the kind of man who knew and did nothing. He had crossed his own name off a list because he refused to belong to the company of people whose names were on it. He had built a case that he did not get to present in a cave that his wife would find by following directions given at his funeral by a woman who had been watching for 40 years. He had trusted in the end not to any specific person but to the general proposition that someone would come. Someone who hadn't given up yet. Someone with enough left in them to pick up the thing he hadn't been able to finish. She had been that someone. Not because she was exceptional. Because she had walked through the door, swooned. She went back to the cave in the first week of April, months after Greta Holt had confirmed it was safe to do so. Months after the formal proceedings had moved into their slower procedural phases. Norma went back to Opal Winters first. She drove the 3 properties down from the old marsh place, which she had not visited since September, and she knocked on the door. Opal was in the garden, as expected, bent over a row of something early and green, talking to it with the authority of someone who has been proven right before and expects to be proven right again. She heard Norma come through the gate and did not straighten up immediately. "I knew it would work out," Opal said. How, Norma asked. How did you know? Opal set down her trowel and straightened slowly, one hand on her lower back. She looked at Norma over her glasses. "Because Harold used to go up to that ridge when something was troubling him," she said. Said it was a good place for honest thinking without other people's noise getting in. He told me about the cave before he died. Told me about some things he'd seen from the inside of those board meetings, too. Things he wasn't proud he'd stayed quiet about. She picked up a handful of weeds and dropped them in the bucket. And then I saw Cal's truck on the back road in his last year. Same direction. I put the 2 things together and I knew what he was carrying." She paused. She looked out over the garden, and I knew Winifred would do what she did. So when I saw you at that funeral still standing straight with your back to all of them, I thought that one. That's the one who hasn't given up yet. "Plenty of people know that cave is there," Norma said. "Nobody goes in." Opal looked at her over the glasses. "That's exactly right," she said. "Plenty of people know it's there. Nobody goes in." She turned back to the garden. "Only people who still want to find something." Yeah, the trail to the cave had changed with the season. The mountain laurel had lost its winter stiffness and the new growth was coming in along the creek banks. The particular green of early spring in the mountains that has a quality almost aggressive in its freshness, as if the color is making a point about what survives winter. The creek was higher from the snowmelt and louder than it had been in September. She could hear it from further up the trail. She carried a candle and a box of matches and nothing else. The suitcase was at home. The entrance to the cave was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply grown less afraid of small spaces. She bent her head and went in. The main chamber smelled the same stone and cold, and time that does not move the way surface time moves. The crack in the right-hand wall admitted the same narrow blade of light, falling across the same area of floor, independent of anything that had happened since September. Some things do not register the concerns of the people who pass through them. Caves are among them. She stood for a moment and let her eyes adjust. Then she went to the wall. The old marks were there. The tally lines and the drawings and the accumulated evidence of the various people who had sat in this place at various points in the last century and needed somewhere that wasn't anywhere. She looked at all of it. She had looked at it so many times now that she knew it the way you know a face without having to look directly by the accumulated impression of many lookings. And Cal's marks. The letters he had cut into the limestone at crouching height, in the compressed handwriting of someone writing with urgency and care in equal measure. Some of it had faded further with the winter moisture. But the first section was still clear. I need to finish. She held the candle near the letters and she read them. She read all of it that was still readable, which was most of it. She read it the way you read a letter from someone who is gone, knowing what you know, now that you didn't know when it was written, and understanding that the knowing came at a cost and arrived too late, and that those two facts do not cancel each other out. She took the nail from her coat pocket. She had found it at the farm where she worked, a square-cut nail, the kind that turns up when you're digging in soil around old outbuildings, the kind that hasn't been manufactured as a standard product for 100 years. It was about 3 inches long. It was heavy enough to cut limestone. She knelt on the cold floor of the cave. The cold moved through the knees of her jeans immediately, and she did not mind it. She pressed the nail point against the stone, and she found a section of wall beside Cal's writing close enough to be in the same conversation, but not overlapping with what he had made. She cut her letters slowly. She was not a person who wrote things quickly. She thought about each letter before she made it, the way Cal had thought about each word he had written in his composition notebook. Economy, precision, not a mark more than the thing required. When she was finished, she sat back and read what she had written. Cal, I finished. She looked at it for a moment. Then she pressed the nail to the stone again below the first line, and she added 4 more words. Nell still here. She set the nail down on the floor beside her. She sat with her back against the limestone and her knees drawn up and the candle burning at the base of the wall, throwing its small circle of light across the marks on the stone. The old ones and Cal's and now hers, 3 layers of time, in the same pale rock, each one made by someone who had come here, because they needed a place that was separate from the arrangements of the world outside, and had found it, and had left the evidence of themselves behind. The light through the crack in the wall was changing, going from afternoon white to the orange of early evening. She knew this light. She had learned its patterns over the months of coming back here, the way the cave measured the day's end in the only unit it had. She did not move yet. She thought about Opal Winters, who was at this hour probably in her garden talking to whatever was coming up through the soil in the first warm weeks of the year. She thought about Everett on the highway between here and Lexington, with his case law textbook open on the passenger seat. She thought about Mary Ferris and the day in the fall when the sheriff's deputy called her house. She thought about Cal, not about what had happened to him, about who he had been in here in this specific place in the months before it happened. She thought about him crouching at this wall with whatever sharp thing he had cutting words into the rock, with the focused patience of a man doing the only thing available to him. She thought about him walking out of this cave on the last night he ever came here, stepping from the dark into the moonlight outside and going home. Going home to a house that was not really his any more than it had ever really been hers. Going home to a woman who was asleep and did not know where he had been going home carrying everything he carried. She thought about all the things she had not known and could not have known, and she let herself feel the weight of that without deciding the weight was something that needed to be resolved. Some weights you carry. They become part of how you move through the world. They change your gait in ways you stop noticing. She thought about what it means to be the person who finishes the thing, not the person who starts it, not the person who conceives of it or whose name is on it, or who gets the credit for understanding why it needed doing. Just the person who was there when the finish line was reachable and who decided to go ahead and reach it. That person does not have to be remarkable. They do not have to be fearless. They have to be present, and they have to not stop. Those are the only requirements. She had been present. She had not stopped. Outside the cave, the evening was settling into the hills the way it does in the mountains, not falling exactly, more like pooling in the low places first, and working its way up the ridges gradually, the dark arriving from below more than above. In another 20 minutes, the trail down to Miller's Creek would require a flashlight. She had one in her coat pocket. She stood up. Her knees ached from the cold stone. Her back was stiff in the particular way it got when she sat on cave floors, which was a thing she had not known would be a recurrent feature of her life the previous September. She picked up the candle and she looked at the wall one more time. The lines of writing, old marks, Cal's marks, her marks, occupied a section of limestone no larger than a piece of notebook paper. In a cave full of evidence that people had always been passing through this ground, stopping here for reasons the stone did not record. Leaving what they left and going on those lines were just more of the same. More evidence, more presence, more proof of the general fact that people were here, that they existed, that they felt the need to say so. She walked out through the inner passage and the main chamber, and the entrance, ducking her head at the low part, stepping out into the evening air of the ridge. The air outside was different from the cave air, warmer, moving. It smelled of new leaves in the creek below and the particular greenness of April in the hills of eastern Kentucky, which is a smell she did not have a single word for, but which meant more precisely than any word that winter was done, and the ground had decided to try again. She stood at the mouth of the cave for a moment. She looked out over the ridge and the tree line and the valley below where the lights of Clover Creek were beginning to show in the dusk, small and steady. The ordinary lights of people in houses going about the ordinary business of an evening. Cooking something. Watching something. Talking to someone, or sitting in comfortable silence, or looking out a window at the same ridge she was looking at from the other direction. She had walked into this cave the previous September as a woman with no place in the world. That was the fact of it, stripped of sentiment. She had been put out of a house that was not hers by a woman who had always known it was not hers. She had walked into these hills with a suitcase and a paring knife she had taken without knowing why, and she had sat in the dark and cried the kind of crying that clears a person. And she had woken up and found her dead husband's handwriting on a wall, and she had done what the handwriting asked. She was still here. She was 43 years old, and her back hurt, and she owed 2 months' rent, and she had a garden to plant, and a neighbor's tax forms to help with, and a long drive ahead of her tomorrow to testify at a deposition in the civil case that was still working its way through the machinery of the courts. She was here, and she had things to do, and the things she had to do were hers, not performed for anyone, not earned by behaving correctly in someone else's house, just hers, carried in her own hands, going where she decided. She clicked on the flashlight and started down the trail. The creek at the bottom was running loud and cold with the snow melt, and she crossed on the stones the way she had learned to do it in the dark, testing each one before she shifted her weight, moving slowly, not looking at the water but at the next stone, and the next. This was also something she had learned. You look at what's in front of you. You move to it. Then you look at the next thing. The trail widened at the bottom. The lights of the settlement were closer now. She walked toward them steadily, the flashlight making its circle on the path ahead of her. The night coming in around the edges of it big and dark and full of the sounds of a Kentucky April. The frogs starting up in the low places. The last birds calling before they stopped for the night, the creek running the wind in the trees. Nobody had taken this from her. Nobody was going to.